My name is Olga Nikolajev. I am a death educator and counselor. And what that means is that my role is really to be able to provide information and knowledge to either, folks who are dying or their family in how they can be able to die well, whatever that means. And it's very individual. Part of that death education is to be able to provide public workshops or education, because we live in a society that's very resistant to death and dying, and sometimes even our healthcare system does provide some information, but not necessarily in its entirety or the wholeness of all of those different dimensions of death and dying. And so it's really to be able to assist people to overcome some of those fears, maybe not to eliminate them, because I don't think that they necessarily are gone totally, but how to empower people so they can die in the way that they have lived, and they can do their dying in a good way, so that when they do die, they actually are able to have all of their unfinished business complete and be able to say the things that they needed to say. But I also think that the other part of it is, one of the things that I've learned in my own experience is that death is a teacher, and it teaches us to be able to pay attention to the things that are really important now. So many of the people who have had a diagnosis of a terminal illness, their life changes, because they sort of have had a wake-up call, and they start doing things a little bit differently. So I'm just starting out, because it's something that it's not, in our culture, it's not really, people are interested, but they're not necessarily welcoming it too much yet. They're not quite sure. And so I use specifically the word of death educator, because sometimes what it does, it kind of, it creates a little bit of a shock wave, and then I explain what it is. And then it's sort of, oh, that's interesting. Okay, tell me more. What does that mean? And I think it's a social movement. I think many of the folks, and I'm not the only one, and I'm not by any means an expert. I think the expert is really the person and the family who are dying, because it is about their life and how they will complete their presence here. But I think it's really about a movement to bring death home. And that sounds kind of scary, but there's so many people that want to be able to die in their own home, because it's a comforting place. It's a place where they have the familiar, where they have their family. And of course, there's always going to be people who don't want that. But it's really about how to be able to bring that dying back home, because dying is not an illness. Dying is a social condition. Death is like birth. We've complicated it, and of course there are complexity and illnesses that makes it more complex. But in its essence, dying is really about a social thing. It's about, it brings people together. And so there are those of us who really want to be able to educate people, empower people, teach them how to have, funerals at home, teach them how they can care for their family members or their friends or people that they really care about, to be able to care for them at home or in hospital and those kinds of different places. And again, I think, you see the different expressions of that death positivity or that social movement. So popping up different kinds of schools, such as Beyond Yonder for community death care. There's lots that's being done in the States. Canada is a little bit behind in this movement, and especially in the field of thanatology, which is the study of death and dying. It's very ripe in the United States. Many folks really learning about thanatology, and which goes beyond, human physical death, but really looks at how do we create cultural norms around dying? How do we treat our animals? How do we kill our animals? Why do people have memorials? Why are folks on the bridges when the soldiers come home? What is it about that? Why is there this draw to be able to bear witness to death or to honor people who have died? And really to be able to study that, and to look at what is loss, what is bereavement, and in some way to demedicalize it and to also normalize it, that it is a normal aspect of life. Death is not the opposite of life. Birth is the opposite of life, death. And so how can we be able to normalize it? Because it's one of those things where it's going to happen to all of us. And it is, you know, folks like Stephen Jenkinson, who's been doing a lot of touring and a lot of workshops in relationship to how can we die wise, how can we die well. And he really puts up front, you know, how can I be responsible for my own dying process and my own death? Because that is part of my responsibility as a human. It's not that I give my power away and somebody else takes over. It's how can I negotiate those spaces within. And so it's really how to not be afraid of the thing that we're all gonna eventually meet in a variety of different ways. But how can we be comfortable with the discomfort of our own end? So I began as a nurse in my early 20s. You know, it was one of those things where in my family, I wanted to actually be a vet when I was younger. I didn't really want to have much to do with humans. And animals were safer, right? Because animals were very predictable. They have a certain way of that they are. Humans, not as much. They have more complexity of their ego. But unfortunately, I wasn't quite sure. You know, we also have to make a decision fairly early when we're 18, when we haven't even experienced life very much, as to what we're going to do for the rest of our life. And it's very different now, you know, so I'm going to date myself a little bit. So going back over 25 years ago, my friend was in nursing. So I thought, okay, that's pretty good. I can go and do that. I dabbled in whether or not I wanted to get into psychology. And my father kind of said, no, that's woo-woo. You don't want to get into that kind of stuff. But I thought, well, there's something there. But I went into nursing because my friend was in nursing, and so I completed that program. And unfortunately, or fortunately, during that time, there was no work in Ontario. So I moved to British Columbia, and I trained as a labor and delivery nurse. So I had the wonderful opportunity to be able to catch some babies as they came in, because you really don't do anything. You kind of just wait and catch. And then, because there was no work, I ended up working in a long-term care home in Vancouver. And I started to see that cycle, you know, the beginning and the end, and how similar they were, and how tender they were, how vulnerable the baby is, the mother is, and how vulnerable our elders are in that moment, and really saw the sacredness of being able to care for them in that way. And I realized that I actually didn't know a lot about dying and about how to be with people who were dying, even in my nursing, because right now, still, it is not a mandatory course. So a physician or a nurse, yes, there's a part within the education system that talks a little bit about palliative care, but it's something that it's a specialty, you know, where I think, but it's part of a holistic way of looking at health, and people, physicians, nurses, PSWs need to be able to have that knowledge, you know? So that was my experience then in my early 20s, and I thought, oh, there's got to be more to this. And I am a life learner, so I went back to school, I went and took psychology, I took anthropology, I studied the cross-cultural rituals of death and dying. I did my master's in religion and culture, and specifically looked at how do new immigrants negotiate the spaces in this society when they don't have the Ganges, because I focused on Hindu and Sikh funeral rites. What about when they can't have a huge fire outside? How do they negotiate that? You know, so looking at what are the funeral homes that are open and can help facilitate that process. So the eldest son, let's say in a Hindu family, can be the one who ignites the fire. You know, what are the symbolism that we as humans can adapt to so that we still hang on to some of those traditional principles and how we can do those. And so the journey just began, you know, in that way, and then continues. And when I worked as a palliative care nurse in Ottawa, again, I still didn't have the fullness of of the skills that I thought I would like to be able to have when being with folks who were dying. You know, we've specialized everything. We've created experts, and so that's why I say I am not the expert. I almost retaliate against that label because it puts me into a box. And so most of the, many of the people who are within this social movement really talk about being in a place where you don't know. Because when I am present with somebody who's dying, I have never been there before. I'm not dying, and I don't have a terminal illness, so I don't even have an awareness of what that might be like. So I can't say that I know what it's like for the person who's dying. And so it's a privilege and an honor to be present because I am learning. I'm learning through those experiences, and they are sharing with me what that process is. And then I take that, and there's many of us who have, had those experiences, and so then we share it with others. This is what the dying have said. This is how the dying could happen. This is what the families, may need, or some way to be able to start those conversations. And I do believe that it is a right of every single person to know how to die. We don't teach that. We don't teach people how to listen, right? You learn how to read and write, so you can parrot back what you heard, but without really taking it in, without really being able to really hear what a person is trying to say. And so, and that's, it's a learning process. It's not very comfortable because there's something inside of us, right? Our will to live is so strong that even in the presence of someone who's dying, there is still a part of me in all of my experiences that I've had. And I've been with folks who were young when they died, very fast, very slow, very old, all kinds of different expressions of their dying. And there's still something that it's like, oh, maybe they're not dying, maybe. And I have to overcome that and be able to, like I said, be comfortable with the uncomfortableness of holding a space for someone. And we talk about that a lot as to, but most of us don't know what that means. What does it mean to hold a space for someone? Yeah. So it's such a learning process. And I think those of us who have death positivity or death awareness know that it's always learning, and that we need to empower people, regular public people, and to know that they have within themselves the skills to be able to care for people who are dying. So I think in the micro, right, so if I just go to the individual, I think someone who has death positivity or death awareness understands that at any point in time their life could end. Maybe not from a terminal illness, but how do I know that I'm not going to get hit by a car? How do I know that something may not happen? And there's lots of things that are happening now that take us by surprise, very traumatic things, whether it's environmental things, whether it's stressors, or whether it's imposed upon us from the outside, or that we'll get a terminal illness and we could die within a few weeks or what have you. So none of us really know when. And having the death awareness then allows me to be able to be authentic. It allows me to be able to say, what's the small stuff that I don't have to worry about? It allows me to not be judgmental because I want to understand another person. And so I have to have the willingness to have a bit of a space to hear what they're saying and to be with them. I do my best to be able to every day acknowledge people, whether it's in the coffee shop or give a little smile or what have you. Death makes you slow down. You ask anyone who has had a sudden death and they will always tell you, it's like, it sideswiped me and I didn't know what to do, because that's what it does. Death and grief stops everything. And physiologically, it just stops everything in your body. You can't think. You just want to curl up and run away kind of thing. You want to retreat. You want to isolate. Death brings you so inside that you don't even know what to do. And so that's on the micro level, right? What it potentially does for the person individually. I think on a larger scale, then that could lead to our relationships with other humans because we want to know who they are, what they are, and how they feel, think, or what have you. We're far more similar than we are dissimilar. Let's just, in all of our expressions of religiosity and political views or what have you, there are some fundamental truths and some fundamental desires that every single human has. But it also changes our relationships with our animals. It changes our relationship with the things that we consume, I mean, I sometimes go as far as saying, every time you sit to eat, understand that what you are eating has already died. Whether it's a plant or an animal or whatever, it doesn't matter if you're a vegan or if you're a carnivore. That plant is no longer connected to its life source. That animal has given its life for you. So acknowledge it. Take the time and to say thank you, right? Because you may not know. Are you gonna, in this society, we don't worry about that. We have so much food everywhere that we have so much waste, and that's a whole other topic, where we're consumed with the prettiness of things. And life isn't the pretty things, having a farm and growing my own food. It's a fight for the resources, whether it be the animals or the birds. And I have to have that relationship and know that I am in relationship with all of those different things. So I have to acknowledge that. And so when I eat, I give thanks to the things that have given life to me. There's a very old story, an old legend and it comes from First Nations Indigenous knowledge, that talks about the fact that when humans first came to this planet, because there are stories that we're not from here, and that when the humans met the animals, and that at that point we could communicate. We had the ability to be able to communicate with the animals, to the trees, to the plants, to the rocks, to all of our relations. That's sort of the basic philosophy. And that there was a covenant that was created, and that the animals agreed, yes, we will give of our flesh for you to survive, but you have to respect and honor us. And I think we have lost that, right? The way in which we treat, the way in which we grow, the way in which we consume. We have lost that agreement. And I think it's part of what causes some of the pain and suffering that we are going through. Because, when you're a kid, and even as an adult, there's nothing that gives you more joy than puppies and kittens. That's why they're so popular on YouTube, right? Everyone's like, I want to watch kitten videos, because there's something that gives you that joy. The animal is in relationship to you, and so we have to honor that. We have to honor it. So why do people fear death? Oh boy, okay. There's probably, let's just go 3 things. And again, this is based on my knowledge. So my information, experiences that I had, therefore equal knowledge that I hold, right? And there are many other folks who have different philosophies and different ways of looking at it. I think the first thing is that we've removed death and the death positivity or death awareness out of our consciousness. Somebody else takes care of that, right? We are no longer the ones who kill the animal, who whatnot, nor are we the ones very much to be able to have a person die at home. Only I think a very small percentage, probably 1/3 of folks are dying at home, although more than 70% of them want to. But the reality is that our system isn't conducive, and part of it has to do with the fact that we've created this expertise, we've put it into a healthcare system, and have disempowered people to take care of their own at home. So that's one. I think that we've removed it, and so people think that it's not accessible to them, and so they're like, well, somebody else will take care of it. The other is that if you look through the history of death and dying, you'll see that every religion has a way to be able to use death as a position of fear. If you are not a good person, God will punish you and you will die, right? In a nutshell, that kind of thing. So it's being used as a way of in some way, govern, I would use a loaded word like manipulate people into submission, into being a civil society per se. Right? So that's 2. the other, I think, is that it is the greatest unknown, right? It is the thing that we don't know very much about. And there are folks who have died and have come back to tell the tale, and we think those are fantastical, but we still have a piece of ourselves that says, I don't know. And that is what scares us, not knowing. And the only way that you can make the unknown known is to be with it. Now, I can't be with death myself in my own death, but I can certainly be with others who are dying, so I can get more comfort. I can learn more about death and dying so that I become a little bit known in the unknown. But the truth is, at the point when I die, maybe there isn't anything. I don't know. I have no idea. And so overcoming that fear is really about acquiring knowledge, being with people who are dying, opening yourself up to the vulnerability of your own fears or what have you. You know, I always say that fear either means forget everything and run, right? Or friendly energy announcing risk, because the unknown is a risk. You know, anything that you have ever tried that's new is unknown. But once you're in it and you try it a couple of times or what have you, then it becomes more known. It's, I think, one of the reasons why we have conflict and we have this resistance is because that's unknown, that's not me. And it is, we have separated ourselves so much so that we reject anything that is not like me. And if it doesn't have the same philosophy, if it doesn't look like me, if it doesn't smell like me, then I don't know what that is and I don't want to have anything to do with it. And that is part of, I think, as a global community, is what we have to overcome. Have the willingness to have a conversation with somebody that we don't know, to be in a place of vulnerability and sometimes fear, right? But to open ourselves up and then make the unknown known a little bit. I think that when a person is, and this is what I've heard from some of the patients, there's two things that happen. Is they have an awareness that their life is finite, and it's like the first confrontation. They may have thought, or they kind of knew in the back of their mind that their life was finite, but all of a sudden it's like they have this validation. Yes, it is finite. And so then things kind of stop, and then they look at their life potentially if they want to. Not everybody does, so understand that it's not always a death positive kind of an environment. But people oftentimes they'll change jobs, they'll do something different, they'll let go of friends, they'll introduce themselves to new friends, they'll oftentimes go back to the things that gave them a lot of joy when they were younger, or the things that were really important to them. They let go of some of the material things. If you look at, especially if you look at the markers of somebody who's dying, we talk a lot about that they give away things, that they isolate, that they do these kinds of things because they're preparing, right? They make their world a little bit smaller, a little bit more secure, and they start leaving things, or make decisions based on the fact that they don't have a lot of time. There's some really great stuff going on that shows real life, not sort of reality TV, but real life situations in which a person being confronted with their own death then makes those changes and has deeper connections with their families. Or I love the concept of living funerals, being able to, before you die, to have people come to you and say, I love you and I'm going to miss you. Or, there's some things that you're going to have to change because you have the willingness to be able to say those things to people, because you're willing to risk, because you're not going to be around anymore, and you're not necessarily invested in having people like you, or whatever it is. You're not invested in sustaining that social norm because your life's coming to an end. So it's there are those markers and an opportunity. I think death gives us an opportunity to be able to do things differently. you know, and we have a lot of death in our world. And it's an opportunity. It's like a wake-up call. You know, I always kind of say, well, you know what, the world's not looking so good, so I'm just doing my part to prepare people, because I don't know if we're going to live or die as a human species. The planet doesn't need us. The animals don't need us. None of this world doesn't need us. It would actually probably be better without us. But we're at a decision point. You know, what is it that we can do? How are we going to contribute? Are we just consumers who are just going to be taking? Or do we live in many spiritual paths, religious sects have a core principle that says, how are you going to make this world better by being in it? And so legacies are a big part of what we can provide for people who are dying. What's your legacy? What do you leave behind? You know, how are you going to impact the world? What matters to you? And it doesn't have to be that you save the children in Africa or those kinds of things. It can be the simple exchange, that you're a decent person, and, you know, the random acts of kindness. One of the hardest things one of the hardest things for me was to be able to do a random act of kindness without telling anyone, without even necessarily having people notice it, because it's about me. When you die, even though you might have lots of people with you, you are alone in your experience. And so how can I teach you or share with you? Really, I'm not teaching you, you're teaching me. The person who's dying is teaching me. How can I share with you some of the things that the dying have shared with me that might make your dying more meaningful for you, whatever that is? I think that it will take time, you know, as being able to provide, let's say, the death cafes, right? And so I like the term death. I mean, most of us in the movement, we do not correct somebody else when they use words like passed on or lost or what have you, because it's not ours to do. But I deliberately use dead, death, dying, you know, has died, whatever, because I think it's important. And little kids, they use that, right? It's very straightforward and it's very simple, and you know what it means. You don't have to be concerned about what that means. So the death cafes, for instance, really are a way to be able to create spaces where people can just come, and without an agenda, without I need to fix you because you're grieving, let's say, or I need you to know the things that I know, and sort of deliberate, you know, kind of teaching people a certain thing or having that agenda, is just creating a space where people feel comfortable that they can talk about any aspect of death and dying, whether it be ghost stories, whether it be, you know, that they themselves have thought about wanting to die, that they are still processing the death of someone. You know, it's just a safe space. And the more people that share in those experiences, then they start to realize that, oh, that's interesting. I did think about that, or this is my experience too. And it creates that sharing component to understand most people feel very, very alone in their grief or in their dying. And this is just a way to be able to, first of all, normalize these kinds of conversations and dialogues, but to also know that this is something that we all share. You know, I think it's more challenging in a rural setting because it's a small town. Yeah. And sometimes folks, you know, don't want to be seen affiliated with some of these things. They're curious, and it's going to take time. You know, so right now we had the first death cafe that we had in the small town. We had 13 people because people were from not necessarily from that town who were curious what this is about. Some went off to do their own death cafe, and I'm always welcoming folks to be able to share. And then the next time we had 6 people. You know, it was smaller and still lots of good dialogue, sometimes a little bit confrontational, which was very interesting. You know, different people have different religious philosophies around death and dying and what that means as opposed to others. And then the third one was just 2 people. And it was so like intimate. And so I, as a facilitator, and everybody does it differently. I mean, the premise of death cafes is no agenda, no themes, allow people to just converse, have maybe some initial questions so that it starts the conversation, and maybe put a time on it so people could shift, but it can be in whatever way that you want. I have this philosophy that I like to be more organic. So depending on who shows up, the conversation's going to depend on who's there and what their interests are. And they're all adults, so if they don't want to be there or they don't want to share, they don't have to. It's not up to me to say, okay, you haven't shared, why don't you share? That's not my role. It's just to create those spaces. And another part of the death cafes is to have them in public spaces, so that we might have our little group of 6, but there are other people who are sitting there. You know, I had put up a couple of little tabletops that talk about what the death cafes are. And some of the folks who weren't necessarily in the group had taken them just to be able to, because you're curious, right? And that's fine, no problem, you know, to be able to do that. Curiosity is great, to be able to invite people and have those conversations. But it all takes time. So, you know, when you're building community, we are a culture that has, and I'm just talking about white culture, Western culture, is very independent. We are very, very invested in our individuality. Very invested in our individuality. It's great, but you take it really far and you disassociate from connecting with other people. And so how to build community is it's going to take time. It's going to take, you know, folks to gather people, but it's going to be them who are going to want to do that. So I want to make sure that in my initiation of the death cafes, they are self-sustaining, not because I'm there, but because the people that come want to come together. So, you know, same third Tuesday of the month in the same place, building that consistency, hopefully, will allow people to just continue to gather. That's my hope.
Let me check one thing.
So, having been in the system, what I have seen, and again, my own experience, it's not the experience of every single person. There are some really great work that's happening. And there's a lot of strategies and a lot of really great plans, but many of those plans are slowly moving through. And part of my frustration, and that's why I'm not currently in the system, is that it's slow. And I understand that change can and does take time, but I also know that there's a tipping point where you do a lot of steps and eventually it gets to the point where things will shift. I think that the death awareness, first and foremost, needs to be within the provider themselves. They have to have the willingness to be able to see things differently. And we have, you know, really beautiful models in quality hospice palliative care that looks at patient-centered care with the patient and the family in the center, providing a holistic outlook, right? So taking care of the physical, which includes pains and symptoms, taking care of the psychosocial, taking care of the spiritual. But there's still a little bit of a war between us and them. What's mine to do? What's yours to do? And people are more complex than that. I think people blend together all of those things. So if somebody wants spiritual care, they may want spiritual care that is more based on a human-to-human contact, because that is a spiritual place and not necessarily religious. So if I wanted to have spiritual care, I wouldn't have a chaplain, I wouldn't have a priest. I would want the person who's taking care of me to be able to be open to conversations about, you know, my existential questions. Who am I? Why am I here? You know, what am I supposed to do? And because we've created these expertise and we've created these, you know, palliative care and primary care and all these experts, and they don't always talk to each other, and we're trying to create teams and those kinds of things. But it's still not a holistic, framework. And it goes back to that first question. Death awareness and death education is a right that every single person needs to be able to have. It's not an ownership within the healthcare system. Yes, there are some physiological things that we can tap into and be able to provide some pain relief. But there, you know, you have to ask yourself, is the physical pain caused from the illness, from the treatment, from the fact that the person might be influencing the physical by the psychospiritual components that they're grappling with, that they're in conflict with? And can we be able to ask and facilitate some of that healing, and I'll use that word healing in their death, to be able to you know, provide that holistic care. One thing that I think that providers need to be able to overcome within themselves is this unknown. And there are many examples, you know, when breath turns to air, that physician, and I'm sorry, I can't remember his name, but he talks about the fact of, as a physician, you have to be in a place of, to be able to be okay with the unknown. So that's one, they have to be okay with the unknown. They also have to be okay with the fact that, you know, some folks will have pain in their death. So there's a philosophy in hospice palliative care. There are two that I've heard throughout my career. One is no one should die alone, and no one should die in pain. And unfortunately, what I have seen is that sometimes a person who's dying will wait until people leave. And we spoke about this before, is when I'm dying, I am going to be alone. You can't come with me. And so I am alone. And in our society, we're oftentimes not comfortable with being alone. We want to be entertained, we want to have noise. Sometimes people fear that. But we need to also teach people how to be alone without feeling lonely, with feeling the connection within themselves. So that's one. There's this whole philosophy. No one should die alone. And I can't imagine some people and the agony they go through because people won't leave them alone. You know, we can't do that. The other is no one should die in pain. And so we sometimes over-medicate people because it is very hard for us to bear witness to pain. It's one of the hardest things to do, and I've had many occasions, not even with people who are dying, but people who are in pain because of their illness. And the level of helplessness that I feel when I sit with them is really hard because it, you know, altruistically, I want to take away their pain, and I can't, because their pain teaches them something about respect for life and respect for the choices that they've made and some of the things that they've brought into their life, and about how they can learn through that. You know, one sort of, I don't know if this is true or not, and so take it with a grain of salt, is maybe if we didn't medicate so many people when they're in severe physical pain, that pain would kill them. And maybe we're keeping them alive by numbing their pain. I don't know.